Well, welcome back to Not Done. I'm Sloan Dean, and I'm very excited to have on today Brian Quinn. Brian started as a bellman and then worked his way up through development across multiple different brands, and most recently was the Chief Development Officer for Sonesta Hotels. And I've gotten to know Brian over the last couple of years, actually worked on some deals together, and so welcome to the show, Brian. Maybe we start off with a little bit about your journey and your background so our listeners who aren't familiar with you can get to know you.
Sure. Thanks, Sloan. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And like you said, I think a lot of people in our circles know me from the development side and the different branded roles I had. Came from a big family where everyone had to sort of contribute, and around 16, 17, you had to play sports and have a job in order to stay on the right side of the Angels at the house. I have 5 older brothers, big Irish Catholic family, and wiggled my way into a job driving the van at a Holiday Inn on Long Island in New York, which was incredible. 16, 17 years old. I think it's branded with choice now. The hotel's still there. I get to see it every once in a while. It's right in the middle of Long Island, about halfway between the city and the Hamptons, and it was incredible. Learned a lot. You cannot be late if you're responsible for that 5 a.m. van run because the plane can't take off without the crew.
Oh, yeah.
So,
you'll make a lot of enemies if you're late.
So getting up on time and making sure that you're on shift at the right time and that the van was gassed up and ready to go and the coffee was on. Sleep deprivation became a skill that I learned early and often, but got exposed to, the industry on that side and really enjoyed it. But one of the biggest game changers at that hotel was that we were going through a transition with the food and beverage director. And back then, the GM used to live in the hotel for a little bit at the time. The F&B director would live there. His family had not followed him yet. They were a couple weeks behind. And, with the Bellman driver job, prior to cell phones, you had some downtime. And he really grabbed me and put me under his wing and said, hey, why don't you come into the kitchen, learn how we buy food and beverage and how we manage the cost and what the throughput's like and, how we hire this. I'll date myself one more time. This is when Holiday Inns had nightclubs, if you can imagine that, how they picked the bouncers and the music and all that. And it was incredible, though, because I learned all about the food and beverage side of the business at 16, 17, 18, from a gentleman that's now a friend of mine, Neil Martin, while I was a bellman, right? I've tried to pay that forward. I'm still friendly with Neil Martin. He just had his either 60th or 70th birthday. We were able to have a drink together, and he's as shocked as you and I are with my meteoric rise here through the hotel industry.
Yeah, and then fast forward that. How did you get into development?
I think, I tell everyone, and it's a lesson I learned from my mom to say yes. Right? We all get put in different unique situations throughout life. And if you want an adventure, and most hotel executives all have a journey that they're able to share, which you and I, shared it for a minute with IHG and with Remington, I just kept saying yes when I had an opportunity to move to Florida to go to school, got a job at a few different IHG assets there. And they had a program called Officers, Managers, and Directors Schools. And, in my mind, I was, sort of 20, 21, 22. I don't know that I understood exactly the difference between, ownership and management and franchise and all the nuances there. And the industry was going through a lot of changes, really on an ops track. Got sent to New Orleans. You'll love this. The first revenue management system, which they acquired from American Airlines just to start to help with peak nights, Tuesdays and Saturdays and that kind of thing. And I know revenue management is near and dear to your heart. It was very, very early days in that technology, but they asked me, will you let the wizard and the machine run your hotel? And that hotel was on Royal Street. We had another hotel that was 1 block north of Bourbon. We were 1 block south of Bourbon, and the humans ran the one hotel, and we let the tech run our hotel. Of course, the tech won, right? But but it was wild. It was called Hero.
Hero.
Yeah, there you go.
The Hero installation for I did the Hero installation for 3 Staybridges and 12 Candlewood Suites. This was 2005, I think.
Yeah, this was the predecessor to all of that. Of course, all the humans thought they were going to beat the machine, and I said, no, we'll roll with it, and it really did a lot of the things that you want revenue management to do, and had a lot of fun with it. But here's one of those say yeses. They said, hey, would you be willing to jump on a video and just give a little update? What did you learn this week? What did it do to the rate? How did the employees respond? How did the consumers respond? And they would cut those snippets down and use it for the training when they did the broader launch. So teaching, desk clerks in a convention city like New Orleans to not sell out on a Saturday or Tuesday that you swore that there was multi-night demand that they had to wait for, their heads were exploding. So it was incredible to learn and watch it work, but also say yes. If someone gives you an opportunity, say yes, because so many of the twists and turns got me to where I am. That yes, in that revenue management exercise, moved me over to franchise corporate, helping franchise owners. And that's really what set me on the path to development.
You were most recently the chief development officer of Sonesta, which has gotten to start to be on people's radar. It's actually, I think, the 8th largest hotel company in the U.S. now,
Yeah.
Over 1,000 hotels. I always love to ask people that are in a brand role or have been, do we have too many brands? It seems like there's a brand every minute. How do you think about that, having been a brand guy?
I mean, I think it's something we have to be conscious of, but what drives the brands? There's two competing pressures. One is consumer needs change. Think about the arc of our industry while we experience it. I remember ripping restaurants out of hotels and sort of dumbing down the food and beverage as much as you possibly could in Holiday Inns and Crown Plazas and Intercontinentals, Choice Hotels and Sonesta Hotels. And then all of a sudden, what happened? F&B and hotels pivoted back and is now in vogue. So I think being aware of those changes is critical when you think about why are certain brands evolving and why are more and more brands, coming to market. I think there's also pressure on the branded companies to deliver, right? And if you think about, juggernauts like Holiday Inn Express, Hampton, Fairfield, those products that took brand equity from the leading brand in their family, albeit Holiday Inn or Hilton or Marriott, created a product that had much more mass appeal with the majority of the amenities there, but an opportunity for the operator to drive greater margin because you didn't have as many outlets and as many moving parts there, but the consumer was happy. Those became incredible successes. And now you see that in extended stay, right? We've been on a nice run with extended stay here for 10, 11, 12 years. Lifestyle, luxury, boutique, upscale, upper upscale, having its time in the sun right now because inflation works for that segment. Look, I think that you have to respond to the consumer. All the brands need to exist for a consumer need, but there is pressure on the brands to continue to grow and to provide platforms for growth, right? They always used to say developers develop. So, you build out one segment that was in demand and then, well, what do you got next? What's coming next? I think we can get overbuilt and there can be confusion. My father, may he rest in peace, lived till he was 92, and I always used to use him as a proxy with the brands around Microtel and Microsoft. I would say, Dad, what do you think of Microtel? He goes, yeah, great computer company, and I love Mike Levin and he was a mentor of mine, and, Microtel is probably one of Wyndham's most successful brands, but, I think we're so close to it, we know what most of the brands are, but I have noticed even for myself as we get into 15, 20, 30 plus brands, like, wait, who owns that brand? Where does that sit? Is that mid-scale? Is that upscale? The exciting thing right now, the new brands that have come to market most recently, not so much through the M&A, but I think some of the innovation that's happening outside the big brand families and then some of the innovations inside the brand families is this excitement around the experiential component of what the guest wants, whether it's art, whether it's design, whether it's food and beverage. And that extended stay, I think there you see the best fit where the consumer wants a very narrow bundle of needs and wants. And what's great about that is the owner's making money and the consumer is happy. Quality usually takes care of itself in that dynamic, right? So we've got to continue to, as an industry, find those spots where we can definitely be delivering on a specific consumer need.
Yeah, I had Chris Silcock on the show, and he's over all the brands globally for Hilton. And he had a really smart comment that I think is very applicable, that it's a self-contained, self-correcting system. If brands don't deliver customers and value, eventually developers won't sign up franchise agreements and that brand lose relevancy. There's less of that brand in the marketplace and the consumer sees it less often, and it self-corrects over time. I think what I've witnessed, though, having run a really large brand agnostic third-party manager, is the decoupling of aligned incentives. let's take Marriott and Hilton. They're kind of expected now to grow 6 to 8% net unit growth a year, while supply growth, at least in the United States, is sub 1%. They're just like you were at Sonesta, take a percentage of gross revenues. I often dealt with owners who said, hey, the brand's getting paid, the manager's getting paid, and I'm funding the hotel. I'm not getting paid. There is a decoupling of alignment in some way because, you have the brand and the managers are all paid as a percentage of gross revenue. How did you deal with that, being in a seat where you're the representative of the brand, you're trying to convince an owner to sign up, and you're getting paid whether or not they're making money or not?
In this case that you brought forward, a sensitivity, I think the brands, big branded companies, and at Sonesta we try to be mindful of this, is the commercial engine and the brand offering are both critical components of success. The bundle of services that the brand offers has to be rooted in a consumer need, right? Things like Wi-Fi and a good cup of coffee and a clean room. There's table stakes issues, and then there's certain other things that get curated based on the segment and the price point. For the franchise owner or the development owner or the operator to get value from the brand relationship, the commercial engines have to be strong. And that's why I think you see a lot of money being spent on all of the frequency programs. At Sonesta, we had Travel Pass. You talked about Hilton and Marriott with Honors and Bonvoy. Anything we can do to drive margin through the hotel P&L using the branded commercial engines will continue to bring us back into alignment and strengthen that alignment. So I think all of us that sit on the brand side at different times have to be mindful of that element. The brands exist for a consumer. The energy, in my humble estimation, needs to be around the commercial engine because it brings that sense of alignment back into place. If a reservation comes through the frequency porthole instead of an OTA, lower cost of acquisition, more margin for the operator.
I have a few predictions as we kind of move into 2026. I'm curious to get your take. First is that I think we're at a period that you're going to have a good bit of activity with brands on the M&A side domestically. I think if you look at who's winning and who's losing, and I think scale really matters in this new world more than ever. And as net unit growth slows naturally because supply growth in the U.S. is just slowing, I think two things, predictions I have for the brand companies, there'll be a lot more M&A over the next 12 to 24 months. There will be, the U.S. brands will grow much, much faster outside the U.S. than in, just because there's a lot more green space. What's your take on those two predictions, that we'll see a lot more brand M&A consolidation and the U.S. brands are going to grow a lot faster outside the U.S.?
I think we've lived through a period with some very significant, M&A. If you think about the number of brands, and now you're down to basically, 10 companies that control, 80, 90% of it.
I only see a world that, at least from a U.S., there are 4 or 5 at most over the next years.
I mean, I think if you think of the most recent ones, Kimpton and IHG, Starwood and Marriott, there was, some creaking there, and then the Wyndham Choice dynamic that didn't move forward. There is some pretty big creaking from, the owner community and around, sort of price sensitivity, right? How many of these can you all have on the same platform that are in the same space? There's probably a few more moves that could be made, but I do think where I am absolutely in agreement with you is I think we're going to see international brands come to the States because they see that some of the brands may have some maxed out issues, and also you're going to see the U.S. brands go international. There is so much positive pressure in the Central and South America. You and I worked on some things in Cali together. I see so much demand and travel there. Mexico tried something interesting during COVID, right? They stayed open. And there's something about getting in somebody's travel diary, and what happens if people have a good experience, they go home, they tell people, right? And you see just the change in Mexico, and then that's driving, all these, secondary experiences as well. I live in Tampa right now, direct flights to Colombia, direct flights to Mexico, like never before, because there is all this demand to go south. Quicker trip, stay in the same time zone, but you're still getting experience a different culture. So I think on the international front, the U.S. brands are going to go international because that's really one of the places that you can unlock, significant growth. But I think you could see some of the international brands come in to the U.S. as well. Around your M&A comment, there's a lot of interesting innovation happening. You look at a brand like Stay Pineapple or Palia House, and you look at these smaller brands that are not on everybody's radar, but you go sit in those lobbies, you watch, they're onto something, and what are they doing? It's a return to service. It's a return to a more intimate relationship with the guests, using technology to enhance that stay, right? It's interesting that guest innovations are happening in those micro brands right now, which means they may be ripe, to be scooped up. So I think that's another area that's interesting.
I agree. And, and obviously several of the large chain scales have jumped on it and come out with their soft brands that try to mimic several of those kind of more boutique, smaller lifestyle type brands. Do you think Sonesta would ever sell? Is it still owned by SVC?
Yeah, so just because that's such a near relationship, I don't want to make a public comment on that too much. Look, I'll say this about SVC and Sonesta and RMR. It's an incredible real estate platform, nearly $40 billion under management. They're in every real estate vertical: office, industrial, multifamily, healthcare. SVC is where their travel business sits, including the travel centers, and the hotels. They continue to fight for the right amount of asset mix, right? Sonesta just finished up a process where they did sell about 100 or so assets, but they retained a significant portion, 60 or 70 assets in the major markets, big boxes.
Yeah, I saw Noble Investment Group.
Yeah, right? One of the significant buyers for Sonesta, Simply Suites. Noble's made a big play in extended stay. That's where the margin is, right? Mitt and team are working to leverage that platform up and bring investors in, and I think the extended stay space is one of probably the safest places to help juice the returns for the investment community. I think all the companies are going to try and find the right balance around ownership, management, and franchising. Some of them have already made the bet. I think the wheel is always turning. I think you could see some of the big companies get back into operating and owning as well, because that may be the way some of the transactions that you alluded to, could happen. I think the other component that's out there is COVID was such a kick in the teeth, and you think about, the real estate crash before that. We used to have sort of hotel emergencies or industry emergencies every 20 years. We shrunk it down to about every 10 years, and now we're like almost every 6 or 7 years. The good news is we've learned resiliency. We've beaten up the P&Ls as best we can. We've proven that we can survive through catastrophic emergencies, whether it's on the demand side with something like COVID or on the supply side and on the finance side, through the real estate crash. The other thing that's happening, if you think about the consumer, is the aspiration to travel is incredible right now. So go to the point you made earlier. How can the owners not be making money right now when the aspiration to travel is the highest it's ever been all around the world? It's that pressure on the P&L. Hopefully, interest rates will do two things: allow people to retain their assets and be able to do their restructurings and not get so beat up, on the equity side and the increase in cost. Maybe unlock some of the new construction pipelines that are, really big at all of our, our friends in the branded companies. And allow some of that new supply to come on, because that's always good energy for our industry, right? It brings new people in, it keeps the designers and the architects and that part of the industry going, it keeps the brokers going, it keeps the operators growing. That's an important engine.
The path that we're going down, at least U.S. hotel ownership outside of luxury, is not sustainable long term unless you have just a massive reset in values, which may be forced upon us due to debt maturities, CapEx requirements, and other things. I say that with the caveat, assuming you don't have a massive reset of values,
right,
that something has to change over the next, 5, 6, 7 years, because the owners can't keep losing margin after margin after margin and hoping that interest rates coming down is somehow going to save them.
Agreed. I think the other sort of headwind we've got in this dynamic is there is not a single bullet that's going to solve this, right? We've got to do the hard work around the hotel P&L. I think we have to look at scale differently as an industry, right? A lot of other industries use their scale to try and negotiate with insurance companies, to have a common approach, to the municipalities, and, even think around purchasing. And look, we've tried it as an industry a couple of times, but I think it's a critical component. Oh, and then let's get back to tech for a minute. There's a lot of off-the-shelf, solutions around PMS and around connectivity. The big branded companies have these big investments in their tech platforms. Some of that cost rolls onto the hotels and onto the franchisees, and that there's got to be some shakeout there, because the way some of these smaller companies are doing it is they're buying that off-the-shelf technology. They're not having to maintain the platform expenses as much themselves, and in many cases giving great service, right? The consumer that's buying it through that channel is happy. The cost of acquisition is not really more. In some cases, it's less.
Agreed. I'd be remiss if I didn't take some time and talk about the art of the deal, in that you've been in development roles at multiple different companies. Your best deal you ever did, maybe step us through it, a little bit of storytelling, how it transpired. And then after that, I'm going to ask you about the worst deal, to the extent that you can disclose it.
Sure. On the best deal, I'll give you two sort of examples where I had just filled with pride and a lot of excitement. Royal Sonesta and James were two great brands, upscale, upper upscale, luxury lifestyle. If you think about James, in its original was really at the forefront of boutique and sort of lifestyle and luxury. Through the sort of creation of Sonesta, to allow brands like Royal Sonesta and James to find their footing and be back out in the market, it's just been an incredible experience. I remember when James was out there before, and then it was owned by an operating and a management company for a while, and I think sometimes that's just such a different business, the branded companies and what you have to do to keep a brand alive out in the marketplace versus an operating company. We were able to bring the James brand into Sonesta through an acquisition of some hotels in New York. We got the IP for the brand, and just the inbound demand, the love, the opportunity that people saw for the James brand was really exciting. And we were able to get some assets signed up, one in Miami, one in the islands, and I know that they're sort of rationalizing the portfolio to see where James may fit on some of the owned assets. That was a great brand that stood for something, that owns a piece of this sort of new space that we're in, and to see it get activated, just a lot of fun. And then I think, Royal Sonesta, great name, and I think about internationally how that brand could grow, and what's so fun about that is, the Sonesta family, the previous owners, never franchised it in North America. They franchised it in other parts of the world, but never in North America. So really proud about, launching a franchise platform in North America that had never been launched before. But you think about Royal Sonesta and the potential for a product like that in Central and South America, in Mexico, think about in Asia, think about in the Middle East, think about in Europe, every part of the world. That royal connotation, I think, will serve them well. My time at IHG, I always look back and think about taking a brand that had gone through a big journey. Crown Plaza, it was Holiday Inn Crown Plaza, and then Crown Plaza by Holiday Inn, and then they took the Holiday Inn name off it after the Intercontinental acquisition. I just happened to be there at a moment in time. This goes back to something you brought up earlier: alignment inside organizations, alignment across your leadership team. We got that brand inside the IHG family aligned for a minute. We had the place to meet, so we had a meetings offering. We had a program around sleep, a little bit of a sort of Westin heavenly bed, but a notch below. We had a relationship with PGA and the golf event in Dallas, and it allowed us to grow. And for 3 years in a row, Crown Plaza was the fastest growing upscale brand in North America. Crown Plaza. Incredible, right? But what's the lesson? Alignment, right? Internally, you have to be aligned. The brand, the commercial engine, also around what you charge for that brand, right? That brand wasn't necessarily firing on every element, so you couldn't load it up with the same fee structure as, a Holiday Inn Express, as an example, where the commercial engines were all firing. But it had a place, and you could drive great margins through that business if you understood it. So, and then I think, lastly, I would say at Choice, I just had an incredible experience being responsible for new construction. So think about basically like Comfort, Sleep, their primary new construction brands. And I just had that responsibility working with Steve Joyce and Pepper and Pacious at a time when new construction was, at its peak, right? Think 17, 18, 19. We did almost 800 deals across those brands in those 3 years. So that's a deal every day of the year. And And
Yeah.
that's the first time I had ever really owned that level of volume. Talk about having to drive alignment through an organization, not only empowerment, but alignment, right? You had time to make the decision, and there were those sort of normal stage gates around PIPs and QA and site review and, committee approval, but it had to be wired pretty tight, and everybody had to know what was coming through the pipe, and it better be inside the lines 90-some-odd% of the time if you have to make the decisions that quickly, and that we were able to get that through. I had an incredible team, incredible leadership, had the best SVPs at that time, and we made it work. But that's the power of alignment. We were given an audacious goal, but we drove that alignment inside the enterprise. And if you think back to that time, Choice was also out in the marketplace in a big way, doing probably one of their biggest advertising campaigns ever at that time, where they had the brand stamp on there and they were just, aligning themselves with different media types in order to get the message out there. So the owners were happy, right? They saw their marketing dollars being spent in the marketplace. Those products were still driving margin through those business platforms. Interest rates were a gift at that time, no question. But those would be three.
What do you think AI does to the hotel ecosystem? Like, if you roll this out 5 years from now, what do you think the impact is?
I hope we catch the wave, and think through the different times when technology has pushed into our space. Sometimes we've had incredible successes with it if you think about GDS and connecting to the airline systems, but also you may have been an early adopter. I know I was, for the flat screen TVs, and we were buying $20,000 TVs that you can now get for $500. I think we're wary as an industry to get that right. I think there's some quick wins, though, around AI. Take the economy segment, which is under a little bit of pressure right now. It will come back. It always comes back because it's where people potentially trade down to. And I don't mean that in a derogatory fashion. It's just,
yeah, of course.
You can still get your lodging need covered at a lower cost. Think about the segments that stay in those hotels. There are truck drivers that are driving materials around the country. They need a place to rest. A lot of that happens in the economy and mid-scale space. Think about crews, whether it's train crews, flight crews, other types of industrial crews that are moving around the country. Specifically around train and truck, technology is coming for those jobs, right? What are we doing as an industry to replace those segments as that industry evolves? It's not going to happen tomorrow, right? We just got Waymo in Tampa. I signed up to be a test bunny for that. 5 years, what is that going to do to the number of people on a train crew or on a trucking environment? We've got to use the technology to see around that corner now. Everybody that's a steward of an economy brand, what are the segments we're going to invite in? What are the new segments that are going to be created so that we can fill that in as that changes? That's the leap, I think, that has to happen so that we use it to our benefit. Think about hyper-personalization, right? Again, aspiration to travel, you talk to CBRE, MMGY, HBS, Cleveland Research. All of them say the aspiration to travel is as high as it's ever been. It's going to stay high. From the most recent unemployment, it's ticked up a little bit, but not to a level where people are going to start pulling back on their discretionary spending around travel, at least. I think the majority of the pullback in the U.S. we're seeing is just we've got to reset our welcome to our international travelers a little bit. But the consumer is telling us they want hyper-personalization. And we have more access at our fingertips to what you or I may like when we're staying at a hotel. It's never been easier to be hyper-personal than it is right now.
I totally agree. Well, we've come to the time where we always like to end on some rapid fire as well as thought-provoking. Favorite hotel in the world?
I would say the Intercontinental in the Dominican Republic, just because I had such a unique experience there. When Holiday Inn was buying Intercontinental, we were competing against Marriott for that transaction, and landing and doing the due diligence on a sort of clip chart and faxing it in was an incredible experience. And that hotel's burnt into it's on Christopher Columbus Boulevard and had a casino, and it's every inch of it is burned into my mind.
Best career advice you've ever gotten?
I think I'll give the one that I shared earlier. Say yes. You may get invited to learn a part of the industry that you didn't think you were passionate about. I was on an ops track. I didn't even understand the difference between franchising and operating and owning. Say yes, because if I didn't say yes to learning the food and beverage and just, hanging out with that food and beverage director, if I didn't say yes to be a test dummy for Hero, if I didn't say yes to leaving ops and moving over to franchise ops, I wouldn't have had the amazing journey, that I've had. And then the last piece is tell your story. I think the COVID and the real estate crash gave, hospitality a couple, good square punches to the chin. There's still so much great about this industry, the people, the ability to meet people, the ability to travel. I got to all 50 states before I was 50 years old. We got to tell those stories because that's intriguing to everybody.
It's not like we're working in the morgue. We're working in beautiful, amazing places.
Yep.
What about favorite book?
Right now, I've been playing with this book, reading it on and off. It's called Confetti. And it is sort of a old school. Oh, here it's right here.
I've never heard of it.
It's an old school book from ops guy James Ferguson, all about the something we're all taught, and then everybody forgets. How you treat your employees is how they're going to treat your guests. All the things we came up with that everyone value engineered. The back of the house should be as clean as the front of the house. Yeah, it's expensive to serve lunch, but giving them that 30 minutes off, and it may be the best meal they get all day, right? Acknowledging that people need to rush home and handle their child care. Little tiny things that we used to do all the time. Yeah, there's risk with throwing the holiday party. There's risk with throwing the summer party. Somebody could always act out. But all the good things that come from creating that camaraderie and having a nice meal together and having those shared experiences. So a lot of Confetti is just going back to those culture issues, the stand-up meeting, looking people in the eye, walking around the hotel, picking up the cigarette butts, getting the dust bunnies out of the corner, calling your clients on their birthday, knowing what sports their kids play, know their spouse or their person's name. Those little things, that's why we got all into it.
What about a brand that if you were to launch a brand tomorrow, what would that brand look like?
Where I think there's a white space and people are nipping around it is extended stay, but upper upscale. And you think about Homewood, Sonesta ES Suites, Residence Inn, Staybridge. I would say they're upscale.
That high-end apartment.
Yeah. Demand for design, high-end residential fixtures, call it RH as a proxy.
Right.
But a guest room where I'm in charge. I get put on a special assignment for a month. I'm going to be entertaining clients. I want to be able to have people back to my room. I may have my family come visit me. You want an aesthetic. That caliber of traveler at that price point wants an aesthetic that's like their home, right?
Totally. Yeah, you're almost stealing VRBO customers back to the hotel landscape, right?
Yep, and a few people have played there. They've tried it. But I think two proof points that are out in the market, right? The power of extended stay. If you get that bundle right, you don't need to be in the room every day. You don't have the check-in, check-out transactions. You don't have the doorman transactions. You don't have the sort of meeting space pressure, right? So that cost recovery is there in extended stay, but the service profile, delivering it at that upper upscale in a hotel model where I can get my points and I have the good housekeeping seal and I'll still get acknowledged when I come through the door. Just think about how our kids are going to get jobs, and the mobility and the technology has given us the ability to have C-suites that live all over the world but still be able to be productive, but at times are going to need to come together.
I think that's totally spot on. Well, Brian, thanks for being on the show today. I really appreciate it. Brian Quinn, what are you not done with?
I think one thing I know I'm not done with is enabling others to have an incredible journey in the travel industry like you and I have. I'm mentoring a few people right now. I'm watching a couple of college kids, a couple of my friends' college kids that have expressed an interest. And I know I got pulled along the way by GMs, by that gentleman that I spoke to, by those leaders that I called out at Choice, at IHG, at Sonesta, at Hilton, at Driftwood, now at Equinox. And I want to be someone that brings people along because it's just been an incredible gift, to my life. And I think when you achieve some level of success, you do have that obligation. I'm going to fight to make sure that the hospitality industry stays hospitable. And I'm not giving up. I think the franchisor-franchisee relationship is the most powerful one in business. You just got to do it right. You got to find that alignment and balance. But you look on your phone, that's all licensing, that's all franchising. Drive down any street. How do great ideas scale? Through licensing and franchising. So we got to find that balance and the realignment, but I think it's here to stay, and I think it's one of the most powerful things to give people experiences and unlock, great ideas. I'll leave it at that.
All right. We'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right.